introduction and then we'll get started. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us today with the International Association of Woodcarvers. I think this is our, 6th or 7th meeting. Today, we're honored to have Mr. Dave Stetson with us from Scottsdale, Arizona. He's a co-creator and founding member of the CCA. He, along with Steve Prescott, got together and decided to create the CCA, so he's going to be talking about that today. I want to give you a few things, a few bits of information that's going to be coming up. Kaylee Schofield from Woodcarving Illustrated will be with us next week at 3 p.m. She's going to talk to us a little bit about their magazine, how to submit articles to the magazine, how they do article selection, and the process of creating an article. So if you've ever been in Woodcarving Illustrated, you may want to join us and share information about how your process went. And if you have a goal of being in the magazine, then she'll be able to give you information as far as what you need to do to submit those projects and what they go through to screen those and decide which ones they put in the magazine. Wanted to remind everyone that we do have a Teespring merchandise page set up where you can go out and purchase t-shirts and sweatshirts and all different kinds of things with our logo on it. Again, if we make any money off of that, it doesn't go to us. It's going to go to improve the process and maybe do some promotional type stuff. So feel free to go out and check that out if you'd like. Wanted to remind people that there are all kinds of opportunities for carving ideas out there on the internet, so make sure you're taking advantage of those. Dave may speak to some of the stuff that he's been doing, but he's done some daily tip videos that shows processes as far as carving caricature busts, so you may want to go out and check those out. Mr. Bart Wilson's doing a video series on Sunday on Facebook where he does Sunday Fun Day projects, and you can tune in and watch those or watch the recordings. I think he's posting those on the Helby Woodcarving page. Woodcarving Illustrated has some video series things that's going on. I think recently Bob Hershey did one on carving rocks. You can go to their page and find videos there. Doug Linker does videos on YouTube. So there's several opportunities to find new ideas. Make sure you're taking advantage of those. If you have ideas for weekly meetings as far as people that you'd like to present, please feel free to contact myself or Tom, and we'll take those suggestions into consideration as we decide who's going to be presenting next. And without further ado, we'll go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Dave Stetson and let him tell us more about CCA and his adventures in carving and how he's gotten to the point he is today. So Dave, thanks for joining us, and it's all you.
Okay, buddy. Not sure where to start, so if anybody has a question, feel free to interrupt. I had an idea, but it didn't come out of my mouth. I don't know if I've lost myself on the screen. Anyway, back in '89, I think it was, I had heard about a group of carvers that would get together in Monument, Colorado, which is just north of Colorado Springs. I had been stationed at Fort Carson, Colorado when I was in the service back in the late 60s. And so I knew Colorado Springs, I knew about the Air Force Academy, I knew about everything, but I had never heard of the National Carvers Museum. So I don't even know if it was there then or not, or when it showed up. But went up there nonetheless with the family and showed up at the museum. They had a big circus tent set up outside. And the carvers had set up tables displaying their wares in the circus tent. And I wandered around and bumped into some people who I didn't know, had never seen before. One of those people I bumped into was Steve Prescott. I saw the pieces that he had on the table, his cowboys and such, and I thought, wow, this guy's pretty good. I'm gonna have to see if I can spend a little bit of time with him. And in wandering around, I bumped into Cleve Taylor, and Cleve was going to have a class the next day. But I spent the better part of that day with Steve. His wife, Pat, was there with the kids. And I wasn't really interested in the families. I was more interested in the carvings. But later I found out that night, Steve was going to do a video for the museum. And he was doing a video on carving his baseball player leaning on a bat. So he asked me if I wanted to hang around a little bit and help him out while he was doing his video. I mean, that's how fast we hit it off. And I said, yeah, sure. So I wanted to know as much as I could about this video business. And that's back when people had VCRs. Some of you don't have a clue what I'm talking about, but the old guys know what it is. Anyway, Steve did that video, and as he was doing his video and pointing out some things, if anybody happens to have that video, you'll see at one point he was using his fingers to point at details on the carving. And Steve was not a small guy, even then. And he had hands that were like baseball mitts. And he would use that finger to point. And I said, you can't tell what the hell you're pointing at, Steve. I said, you need a pointer. So I handed him a pencil. I said, use this as a pointer. And that's when the pencil first came into play, which kind of occupied a lot of our relationship over the years, off and on. It was a point of contention that he always took a chance to stick a jab at me with the pencil thing. As it turns out, the next day I had signed up to do a cowboy class with Cleve Taylor. And Steve walked into the classroom and said, what are you doing? I said, I'm carving a cowboy. He says, well, what do you want to do that for? Why don't you come out and carve with me? I thought for a minute, and I thought, okay. So I got up and left. And Cleve's been giving me a hard time about that for the last 30 plus years. Claims I never paid for the rough out or the cutout that he had. I'm sure it was all at $5. But Steve and I sat out there and carved in the tent. I had some blanks with me of a cowboy bust. And Steve carved one and I carved one, and we took a picture of it. And then we traded. I don't know if you can see that. But the photo came out pretty good for me. I mean, it was just a cheap little camera. But we took a picture of him, and I kept the one that Steve carved, and he kept the one I carved. And that photo actually made the cover of the Mallet magazine. But on the way back to the hotel after his video, the wives had taken the kids back because the motel they were staying at, as I recall, had a pool. So they gave the kids a chance to swim and have a good time while we were doing the video thing. But on the way back, I told Steve, I said, you know, this whole thing about caricature carving and caricature carvers, caricatures get a kind of a bad rap. It's if you don't know how to do realistic, then you just call it caricature. It's if you can't carve well, then just call it caricature. And because that was the impression that so many people had of caricature, it was kind of the redheaded stepchild of wood carving. People, it just didn't get any respect at all. And now if you carved a bird, whether you're a good bird carver or a bad bird carver, it didn't matter. You were carving birds. So, you know, you were elevated in the wood carving society. And that always bothered me. because I thought, we're getting a bad rap because there's so many bad carvers. But if we could get a bunch of good carvers together and put on an exhibit of good caricature, maybe we could elevate the level of the public's perception of caricature carving. The bird carvers had the Ward Foundation, and I think that's where they get a lot of their prestige from, which is a gathering of the best bird carvers, and that's kind of where their notoriety comes from. So the idea that I was presenting to Steve was to create a group of the better caricature carvers and have an exhibit of our work, combined exhibit. If everybody put in 2 pieces and we had 25 members, hell, that'd be 50 carvings. That'd be enough for a decent exhibit. And Steve told me, he says, he says, I had some friends in Texas that were going to do that one time. He said, Charlie Winstead and a couple of his cohorts had a group, and they called themselves the Caricature Carvers of America. I said, well, that's kind of the name I was thinking about. And I said, so what did they ever do anything? Or he said, no, they made some business cards and they talked about it, but they never did anything. It never went anywhere. I said, well, let's do something. Let's make it go somewhere. And so he and I talked about it. When we got back to the hotel, he and I sat alongside the pool and we started writing down the names of carvers that he knew or I knew or that we knew through Chip Chats or the Mallet magazine that were good carvers. And we were making a list, and hell, we had 45, 50 names on that list of guys that we thought were really good carvers. But the more we talked about it, the more we said, and this probably was Steve more than me, said, if we include this guy in the group, there always seems to be problems with anything he's associated with. He starts out fine, but then he doesn't get along with this person, and then they don't get along with that person, and the next thing you know, the whole thing falls apart. So he says, we got to be careful who we select for this group. So it wasn't an exclusive group, but it was a group of guys that could get along with each other. And they weren't all necessarily the top ranked or top named carvers, at least not in our mind. I mean, and I won't mention any names, but one in particular came up because he was a good organizer. He was a caricature carver, but not all that great of a carver, but a really good organizer. Other guys, I mean, they had special talents that we could use in an organization. So we were a little bit careful. We narrowed our list down to 13. And the next time I saw Steve, and we communicated back and forth through letters, sharing ideas on the whole thing. And the next time I saw Steve was at the West Texas Woodcarvers show, which was in Denver City, Texas. It was out in the middle of nowhere. It's out between Odessa and Roswell. There's nothing out there but caprock, oil wells, and nothing. But the guys out there had a certain sense of humor that was pretty dry, and they were a different breed than what I was used to. But Steve was there, and Dave Dunham and Jack Price. And I got to meet some other carvers, and Benny Bridges and a few other guys that were from the Denver City group. And we talked more about the CCA idea. And Steve says, what are you doing after the show? And I said, well, we were going to head back. I had a tent trailer with us, and we were going to head back to Arizona and stop in the mountains and camp for a few days. So it was part of a vacation. And he said, well, why don't you come with me? He says, we can go to Fort Worth. You guys can spend a week with us, and Pat and Jeannie can do things with the kids, and I can take you around to meet some other carvers. And I said, well, what other carvers? And he said, well, you could meet Claude Bolton, and we could go to dinner with Dave Dunham. You've already met him. And then there's Jack and Lamont Price and Claude Bolton and Gary Batt, and I'll introduce you to Chris Hammock. And I thought, wow, he's throwing out names that sound pretty impressive to me. So I said, talked to my wife, and we decided, I said, I don't want to drag this tent trailer all the way to Fort Worth. He said, well, my brother lives in Odessa. He says, we'll stop there for the night. You can leave your trailer in Odessa, go with us to Fort Worth. You stay with us. And then when you're headed home, you just stop and pick up your trailer. Well, hell, sounded like a good idea. So we get back to Fort Worth. And one of the names that we had bantered about and talked about was Gene Zesch. Now, Gene lived in Mason, Texas. So I asked Steve, I said, so how far is it to Mason? He says, oh, a couple hours. I said, okay. So as we're driving to Mason, Texas, Steve's driving, and I'm writing this letter to the other names that are on this list that we had created for the CCA. And about 4 hours into our trip to Mason, I said, I thought it was only a couple hours. He said, well, I didn't think it was this far, but yeah, it turned out to be about 4.5 hours from Fort Worth to Mason, Texas. So Texas is a big state. But we got to meet Gene, and it wasn't going to be a really cool deal for Gene. So, but the interesting thing about that trip was that, and this is kind of plays on Steve and my relationship. There was a bank called the Commerce Bank in Mason City, Texas. And the Commerce Bank had a whole room full of Gene Zesch carvings. So we pull up in front of the bank, because we're going to check out these carvings before we go see Gene. So we pull up in front of the bank, and Steve says, go in and make sure that we're in the right place, and this is where they're at. So he sits out there in his Aerostar van with the motor running, and I jump out and run into the bank, and I'm looking around, and I don't see anything. Looks like a wood carving. And there was a teller, but she was dealing with a customer. So I just turned around and went back out to the car, and I said, I don't see any carvings in there. He said, did you ask anybody? I said, well, there wasn't anybody to ask. The teller was busy. We'll go back in and ask her. So I went back in, and I'm thinking back on this, and here we are sitting outside the bank with the motor running, and we're running in and out, casing the joint. We're lucky we didn't get arrested. But I went back in, and the teller got done with a customer, and I asked her about wood carvings, and she says, oh, follow me. So she takes me around a counter back into a conference room. And here's this conference room with glass shelves on 3 walls, floor to ceiling, loaded with carvings. I'm just blown away. So I'm checking this place out, and I totally forgot about Steve sitting out in the car with the engine running. So he was probably out there for 10 or 15 minutes before I remembered that he was out there, and went out and got him. Meanwhile, the lady had been telling me about the carvings and offered me a sandwich and a Coke, and just really making me feel at home and feel comfortable there. And Steve walks in and goes, did you forget about me? And I says, yeah. So anyway, we got to see the carvings and got to meet Gene, and we put the letter together that we sent off. We had 15 names selected. Of the 15, 14 of them gave us a positive response. Only one thought he didn't have time to work with the organization for what we were wanting to do at that time. So it started off really good right from the start. And of course, we put our names on the list. So there were really 13 plus Steve and I. And neither he nor I, either one of us thought we belonged on that list. We thought, oh man, I feel a little uncomfortable, you know. I'm not good enough to be with these guys. But and I wasn't. But I've worked at it and learned a lot from them over the years, and I've gotten a little bit better. So we sent the letters out, and we had our first meeting at Paxton Hardwoods in Fort Worth. And we met in a back room, and 11 of the 15 showed up, and we put together a list of bylaws on a Saturday. That included taking a pretty lengthy lunch, and got back together on Sunday morning to finalize everything and reread what we had talked about the day before. And it's the bylaws that we're still operating under. We've made a couple of minor adjustments, but for the most part, it's kind of taken care of itself, and it's held up over the years. And right from day one, it's been like a team of wild horses trying to get away, and we kind of pull on the reins to slow it down and keep things in. It hasn't all been positive. When we started out, we were getting a lot of feedback from guys that hadn't been asked to participate. They really felt slighted. And whenever we had an opportunity to speak to them directly, we just had to tell them straight up, the reason you're not part of this group is because you have a hard time getting along with people. And we didn't need those issues. So, but those are names that'll remain unknown at this time. So, yeah, it's been a good thing. It's not a secret society, but when we have a meeting, what we talk about and what we discuss in the meeting stays at the meeting. We don't tell anybody, or at least we're not supposed to. I suppose our wives know more about what goes on than we do, but that's just one of those things that ends up happening.
It looks like the wives' meetings is more fun, though, Dave. You got to admit that.
Well, right away they decided to create their own organization. They had the CCA Wives Group, I guess you'd say. They seem to have, whenever we get together for an annual meeting, the wives always seem to have more fun than we did. I don't know. I was looking at names that were on here when we started out. I saw Pat's name on there. Pat, are you on here? There's no video and she's muted, but her name's still up there. But you know, Steve was my best friend in carving. Chokes me up to talk about him, son.
I'm here now, Dave. Can you hear me?
Love you, sweetie.
Love you too. You're making me tear up.
Yeah, we've lost a bunch of our members over the years. Early on, Jack Price. Jack's still with us. Shit, Jack will still be kicking when he's 110 probably. He's just really hell of a guy. But Jack was our treasurer. But Jack said, you know, 50 years from now, none of us going to be around. So how are we going to, if this organization continues, if it's still around, how are we going to let those guys know who the hell we are? So right away, we put together what we called a signature collection. So it was each member of the CCA did a carving that they felt was representative of themselves and the work that they do. And we put that together. And in order to, we showed it a few times at different shows and meetings. But in order to make it portable so we could transport it around, the pieces had to be a particular size. So we came up with a dimension of 3 by 3 by 12. Well, one thing that the CCA is known for is not being able to follow instructions. So there were a lot of pieces that did not fall within those parameters. And the reason it needed to fall within those parameters is because they made a box that was made up of PVC pipe that these carvings could slide down into with some bubble wrap so that they could be transported and bounce around. Some of them wouldn't fit into their PVC. So Marv and Doug put together the Goofus Awards. So they made little trophies for all the guys who did the carvings that didn't fit. And it was a guy holding a bent ruler. And it really pissed me off that mine fit in the dimensions because I didn't get one of those. Only the guys that screwed up got one. But yeah, there've been a lot of stories over the 30 years of this. Keith Morrill, you guys have been doing, golf balls have been popping up here and been kind of popular lately. I have a golf ball here that was done by Keith Morrill in 1993. And when they do the golf balls, they put the covers back on to protect the carving. So this is a little Santa that Keith did that I ended up picking up. But there's a cool little golf ball story regarding Keith and Dave Dunham. Dave, retired Marine, who's no longer with us due to an aneurysm. But Dave didn't think in the box like anybody else. Dave did all kinds of weird stuff. He did like little Santa pins that he would carve for the. He was an orthodontist, and he had a bunch of girls that worked for him, and he did these little Santa pins that they would pin on at Christmas time. And on a couple of the pins, he carved Santa with his tongue hanging out. And one of the girls said, "Oh, that's gross. You couldn't do any worse than to have Santa with a long tongue hanging out like a cow." So Dave always would take that as a challenge. So he carved one with the tongue licking a glue glob out of his nose like a drop of snot, because he used a hot glue gun to glue this pin on the back. So he got this Santa with a tongue licking his nose. But Dave carved a golf ball for Keith. And he carved a face on the front of it. And somewhere in the process, you take a golf ball, you put the split around it, and then when you pop the cover off, somewhere in the process, the back cover popped off. Both halves, the cover popped off the golf ball. So he carved a face on one side, and then on the other side of the golf ball, he carved a guy from the back side bent over with his junk hanging down between his legs. And he popped the cover back on that, and he put it back together and sent it to Keith. Well, he told us about it, and we were getting together in Sacramento, and Keith was going to be there. And Bob Travis drove us, Steve and Dave and I, to the airport to pick up Keith. And when Keith gets off the plane, Dave said, "Did you bring the golf ball?" Keith goes, "Oh yeah." He says, "I was showing it to everybody on the plane." He said, everybody got a real kick out of it. They were laughing, passed it all around the airplane. Everybody thought it was really cool. Keith goes, "Did you really look at it?" He goes, "Yeah." Really cool, smiley, funny face on there. Dave says, "Did you look at the other side?" Well, Keith pushed a little bit and got the other cap to fall off, and he saw what he was looking at. He goes, "Oh God, I hope the people weren't looking at that." So Keith was pretty well embarrassed. That was the same time we were all staying with Travis, and Keith liked to run. He liked to go out jogging in the morning. So there was this green area around the neighborhood that Travis lived in, and Keith went out to run in the morning. It was still dark and kind of foggy. And it was a mile around the circumference of this green belt. And when Keith got around to where Bob's house was, from the back of the house, he didn't recognize it. And so he's going around on his second lap and probably going around on his third lap. And he thought, I'm lost and I got no idea where I'm at. So he sees across the road a pool, a park with a pool, and there was a guy out there cleaning the pool. So Keith jogs over to the pool, and we told him, if you want to go out running in the morning, that's fine, but you're not going to make it with this car because we're not going to wait for you if you're not back. So he was getting concerned that we might take off without him. So he goes over to the pool and he asked the guy cleaning the pool. He says, I'm new around here. He says, I'm jogging and I've got lost. He says, can you tell me where I'm at? He says, well, yeah, you're at the park. He says, well, I need to find this street address on Anza. And the guy says, well, I have no idea where that is. And Keith says, well, maybe is there a phone where I could make a phone call? And the guy says, yeah, there's a payphone right over there on the side of the building. Keith says, well, but I'm jogging. He says, I don't have any change with me for the phone. The guy says, well, you can go in the office and use the office phone. So Keith goes in the office and he comes back out and says to the guy, he says, I'm jogging. He says, I don't have my glasses. I can't read the phone book. So the guy comes in with him and says, do you want me to dial the number? But Keith was always, he was like the Charlie Brown guy that had the cloud hanging over him all the time. He was at a carving session at a college in Missoula, Montana. And Keith liked bread and peanut butter. And it turns out that squirrels also like bread and peanut butter. And Keith left his dorm window open and left the bread and peanut butter on his bed. And the squirrel had pissed all over his bed and he didn't have any fresh sheets. So Keith was always coming up on the short end of things. He had a cabin up in Custer, South Dakota. And to get to his cabin, we had to drive across a horse pasture. We'd take the fence down, drive through the horse pasture, take the next fence down, and park next to the cabin. Well, there were about 5 cars going up to Keith's cabin, and so there wasn't room for him to park. So after he closed the fence, he pulled up to the cabin, but he had to leave his car in the horse pasture. Well, we're up there at his cabin and we're standing out on the deck and looking down and says, Keith, these horses really seem to like your car. We looked down and these horses had come up to his car and taken their teeth and scraped them across the hood of his car. So the horses scratched the paint all up on his car. That was just Keith. He was always in a bad spot. But yeah. Another really good story. And if I didn't, I wouldn't believe this if it hadn't really happened. We were having a meeting in Albuquerque one year. I don't remember what year it was. But one of our members, Harley Refsel, Harley had a hard time making meetings sometimes because he kept traveling over to Norway and meeting with the king and coming back. And, it always seemed that he had a trip or something going on at the same time we were going to have a meeting. So he'd missed a couple meetings. And one of the rules of the CCA is that you have to make a certain number of meetings. If you're not going to come to the meetings and participate in projects, then there's no reason for you to belong.
So somebody got upset about the fact that Harley hadn't been there. And I said, well, look, I says, I'll make it my personal responsibility to make sure Harley is at the next meeting. And that was going to be the meeting in Albuquerque. So we get there for a Friday night meeting, and Harley's not there. And I had talked to Harley. I talked to him a month before. I talked to him a week before. And I called and talked to him the day before we were going. And he had his ticket and everything. He's going to be there. So I said, okay, no problem. Harley will be there. Well, we get there for the meeting, and there's no Harley. Next night, we're having a reception. This was a reception where we got to meet Bud Odell, who was a relative of Andy Anderson. But Harley comes walking in. He's a day late. And Harley, what happened? Why weren't you here? He said, I had company. He says, I had my suitcase all packed, was waiting at the door. His wife had taken the car and pulled it around in the driveway. He was going to go out and go down and catch his flight. His wife was driving him down, and a limousine pulled up in front of the house. And he had company, and he just couldn't leave. It turns out that the company that showed up for him was the King of Norway, who had come to visit Harley. And so Harley couldn't just walk off and leave him standing on the porch. So he entertained him for that evening. And the King of Norway thought he was going to spend a few days with Harley. He had come to the United States at the invitation of the president. And I think the president at that time was Clinton. But nonetheless, it kind of screwed with the CCA meeting, kind of screwed with the plans of the King of Norway, who was coming over to spend time with the President of the United States. And the following Saturday night, because some of the guys said, I don't believe this shit. You know, he's just making that up. He didn't really show up with the King of Norway. Well, as it turns out, on Saturday Night Live, they have a weekend update, which is where a couple of guys will sit there and talk about the news of the day. I'm watching Saturday Night Live, and they said, here's what happens when the dignitary of another country shows up at the White House and the president and the first lady aren't there. And they had this camera focused on the White House. This limousine shows up. And people who aren't typically normally doing the job that they had to do because the president and first lady wasn't there. And it was the King of Norway. Because Harley had to go to the CCA meeting, he showed up early at the White House. And they had staff, it was like the Keystone Cops, you know, the staff was trying to roll out the red carpet, and then they had to find somebody to come out and greet him that would look dignified and shake his hand and walk him into the White House. But it showed up on Saturday Night Live. And they didn't mention Harley. They didn't mention the CCA, but it was what happens when dignitaries show up early at the White House. So it's been a crazy ride. It's been a crazy ride, the whole CCA thing. It's not now what it was. That the original was, and that's not to take anything away from the group that we have now, but that original group of guys, they were really special, you know. Now we got guys that, you know, shall remain nameless. That
tell us about the books.
Guys that promote their carving style by carving rocks, you know. But I'm sorry, Tom, what was that question?
Tell us about the books and like the saloon and the wagon or the circus wagon and the things that you guys did that ended up in books.
Well, I had an idea to do a group project. And I presented that to the group at one of our early meetings in Wichita, and that was the saloon. And I was digging back through some files, and I've got just a small folder of stuff from the early days, and it happened to involve the saloon. But some of the problems we had with trying to do a project like the saloon, we designed it so that the saloon itself was 2 halves of a cube. So you have 6 sides, and then 2 of those sides become the floor, 2 of the sides are the back, and 2 are the side of the saloon. And you just fold one over onto the other, and it becomes a cube, and all the figures would store inside of it. So the logistics of doing that, we built a cardboard mock-up in my shop. Steve came up from Texas, and Dave Dunham drove up, and Doug Rain came up from Tucson. And when I would get home from work in the evening or the afternoon, they had totally screwed with everything they could find in my shop to screw with. So yeah, we did a cardboard mock-up of it. We were going to do the saloon, and everybody agreed to it. And then they wanted to do a book. And I said, well, why don't we just do the book on the project? So that's kind of the way it came to be. But when all was said and done, the 2 by 2 by 2 cube had to be packed in a crate. And when I built the crate for it, now the dimensions of the crate exceeded the dimensions that UPS would ship. So we had to truck it wherever it went. And it turns out the maximum you can insure something for was $500. Trucking companies wouldn't insure for any more than that. And you're not going to hire a truck and a driver to take a box somewhere. So we had to send it through trucking companies. We got an estimate on its value from the National Carvers Museum, and Dale Schaefer estimated it at $6,800, 68 something. So we had to insure it for that amount. And you can't find anybody that'll insure a package or a piece of art like that. Even the fancy insurance place in London, Lloyd's of London, they wouldn't even mess with it. So it became a real serious issue. So the sooner we were able to get rid of that, the better. And it turns out Woodcraft decided they wanted to buy it, and they shipped it around to all their stores. Still do, I think. But yeah, that was our first project. So we decided, lesson learned, the next thing we do is going to have to be smaller so that it fits within UPS shipping standards. So whatever the largest dimension that UPS would ship, that's what we have to stay within. So what do? We build a goddamn circus that's on a 4x8 sheet of plywood, for Christ's sake. So that had to be trucked everywhere it went. When we did the train, each train car was individual and was in a box that could be shipped. They could all be shipped separately. But we ended up loading it into somebody's van and driving it wherever it needed to go. So, and that was on display for over a year at the Railroad Museum in Sacramento. They really did it up nice for us.
Say, Dave.
We've had some really good shots at things.
Say, Dave.
Yeah.
A friend of mine was doing a purge, and I got my hands on a hardcover
There you go.
signed by all you guys.
Does it have the insert in it that everybody signed? Yeah.
Right there in the front.
We had to sign all those sheets and then tip them into the books.
She says, "You want this?" I says, "Yeah, I want that."
Cool. Yeah, there weren't very many hardcovers put out there, so.
Says 238 of 500.
500 of them, yeah. So,
Hey, Dave, I got a question for you. I took a class with Floyd a few months ago. Who's the fastest of the CCA guys? Fastest car.
oh, I was going to say, if we had a race, Floyd would lose. He'd be last. Who's the fastest carver? God, I have no idea. It would depend on what you're carving, I suppose. You know, some guys that carve the same thing over and over again, it can knock them out pretty fast. But if they're trying to carve somebody else's idea, it's going to go a little slower. Yeah, we're not into speed stuff. We all participate in whittling contests, but one of the CCA is non-competitive. And that was spelled out right from the get-go. But the reality is, whenever we get together, you couldn't have more competition. Everybody's trying to outdo the other one.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the exchange pieces, Dave.
Yeah, that was, I thought that was one of my better ideas. Each time we get together, we're going to have a trade. And that went along pretty good at first. But then we started bringing guys in, and again, I'm not going to mention names, but they wouldn't get their piece done. They wouldn't plan on a piece. So they would show up and they'd have a stick that had a face carved on it. And they thought that was a CCA trade. And it used to really piss me off. And every time we had a meeting, Steve would sit next to me. And he'd sit there and he'd keep giving me an elbow. You know, don't say it. Don't say it. Just, we'll lead by example. I said, you lead by example. I'm going to tell them what I think. No, don't say it. It'll just piss people off. Or he wouldn't even say piss off. It'll just get people upset. I said, no, I didn't. I didn't say anything. And eventually they started, but it took about 6 or 7 years of trading for some crappy stuff before we all started getting serious about the pieces that we were trading with. But I got some nice pieces, man. I got you know, in 30 years, I've got 30 pieces. I don't have one from everybody, but I've probably only got a couple that I don't really care much for. But for the most part, nice pieces, nice stuff.
Yeah, I got to see Tom Wolf's collection before Tom went to the nursing home. So Tom had a whole cabinet dedicated to those pieces, and you know, there's a piece in there from Clave and Marv and everybody else in there. It's amazing stuff.
We did a signature collection, and I'd forgotten about this. But we did a book about the signature collection, and the book was dedicated to Dave Rasmussen. He was the first one of our members that we lost. I thought there was a group shot in here. I'm not finding it. Yeah, but this is Dave Rasmussen. And Dave's wife, Pat, we still hear from her from time to time. The CCA ladies, Claude Bolton's wife, Marcelie, we just recently, somebody had sent something to Marcelie. She's still doing pretty well. Some of them are in nursing homes. Jack has a couple of gals that are helping him out and taking care of him. They actually were working with Jack to take care of Lamont until she passed, and then they just stayed on and working with Jack. So, yeah, it was a great group of guys. Still is for the most part.
Dave, you talked about Gene Zesch before. I hesitate to ask you this question, but is Gene still around?
I couldn't tell you that. I don't know.
Okay. Reason why I'm asking is about, I guess, 3 years ago, Gene had reached out to me, and he told me that he had a bunch of carvings that people had returned to him, and they had broken off like one of the a foot of the cowboy or something like that, and he needed to get the boot replaced. And for whatever reason, he asked me if I could carve the boots for these replacement boots for these cowboys. And so he sent me a model, and I said, yeah, sure, I'll give it a shot. So I carved several for him, and he said, I'm going to pay you for it. So I charged him. He said, just charge me whatever you think. And so I charged him for what I thought. And when he got them, he said, wow, these are fantastic. And he said, but your prices are way too cheap. You're not charging enough money. So I said, well, that's what I want. So as long as you like them, that's fine. But now I haven't heard from Gene in probably a year and a half now. So I'm just wondering,
Yeah, he's up there in ages. So
Yeah, I know it was. Yeah.
Before we went down to see Gene, we had spent the afternoon with Chris Hammock. And it was a little rub between Gene and Chris. Chris would do little cowboy scenes with a barbed wire fence and a cow or whatever. And Chris was selling some of his ideas, some of his work to Lean & Tree for cards. And one of Gene's customers saw one of Chris's pieces and inquired to the possibility of purchasing it and asked Gene what he wanted for it. Gene says, it's not mine. Well, then Gene's wife is kind of the negotiator for Gene. But they decided that if Chris's work looked so much like Gene's that the customers couldn't tell the difference, then Chris was going to have to do something else because he couldn't, his stuff's all copyrighted. He's not going to have Chris copying his work. Well, Chris told him, he says, I'm not copying your work. Well, just before, about a month or two before Steve and I went down to see Gene, Chris had gone down with Charlie Winstead to see Gene. And Gene was cordial and took him all around, took him back to the studio and stuff. And it turns out that it was shortly after that Gene found out about somebody being confused between Chris's work and Gene's work. Well, they're like night and day if you know anything about their styles and what they do. But Gene was pretty upset.
Right.
So Chris told us about that. And then when Steve and I went down there, Gene told us the story also. So we got Chris's version and Gene's version, and they were both pretty identical. But Chris said, look, you carve cowboys, I carve cowboys. You carve a cowboy, he's got a barbed wire fence, he's got a horse, he's got a cow, he's got a dog, whatever. If your customers don't know the difference between your work and my work, then they're not smart enough to be qualified customers. So that didn't help the matters. But Gene wanted to make sure we knew that nothing that we saw at his place was to show up anywhere in anything we did, anything like it.
Yeah.
But Dave Dunham gets in on the story, and Dave designed a picture that we were going to carve of a cowboy pinned up against a barn door with knives through his sleeves and his pants and his shirt, pinning him to a barn door
and a big Z emblazoned across his chest, cut into his shirt.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, and
That's
the
good.
caricature looked a lot
Yeah.
like Chris.
I've got a
Yeah.
Dave Stetson story that I'd like to see Dave finish. I saw at the Santa Clara Carvers, they had a contest. You could whittle anything you wanted, but you could not blow on your piece. You could not clear the dust off. Do you remember what you did, Dave?
No, I don't.
You walked over to one of the booths that had an air compressor and you just blew the heck out of it with his air compressor.
I didn't remember that, but yeah, I was doing a whittling contest in Hemet, and I had carved a figure. It was a female, and she had her tongue out, and her tongue hung down almost to the floor. And with about 10 minutes to go, I think we had an hour and a half, something like that, to carve. With about 10 minutes to go, I broke off the tongue. Oh shit! Well, that was the whole idea of the carving, you know. So I took the tongue and I whittled it down a little bit, and opened up the mouth, and I took a piece of gum out of my mouth that I was chewing, stuffed it in there like a piece of adhesive, and stuck the tongue in there, and nobody was the wiser. But they said that from that point on, no one could use adhesives in their carving. So I
Because
said,
that was the days before super glue.
yeah, man. You know, back when we started the CCA, there was no email, there was none of this Zoom, none of this stuff existed. And that's the reason we held it to 25 people. Because if we were trying to communicate with guys that were all over the country, and even from Eldon was in Canada, but we had to send letters, or we had to pick up the phone and make a long distance call. Hell, now you pick up your cell phone, you can call anybody around the world, and you're not going to get long distance charges. As long as you got a Wi-Fi connection, you're not going to get roaming charges even. And you can talk to them for as long as you want. But back in the day, you couldn't do that. So it was tough to get going. I got some letters and newsletters that I didn't realize. I went into the file cabinet, and Michelle's been saving this stuff forever. And I've got old newsletters and things that I spent a lot of time last night looking through some old papers to read. It brought back a lot of memories. Things that I thought I'd never forget that had slipped my mind. But yeah, so.
Hey, Dave, can you talk a little bit about some of the pieces you got behind you there on the table?
Yeah. Well, I grabbed one off the shelf because I figured that the flat plane carvers would be on here. This was a guy that I carved years ago, and I did this with my pocket knife. So there's been some talk lately about knives and what you carve with and what you use. But I used nothing but a pocket knife on this for everything all the way around. The face, his coat, everything. So I pulled that off the shelf. Back here is, this is Granny. And you can see she's pretty good size. She's a good 18, 20 inches.
Yeah, now, Dave, we really like the old couple that you do with her, with the grandpa and stuff like that. Where did that idea come from?
I've got this one here. Looks like I don't drop it on the floor. It's an old couple on a park with a park bench and a bag of bird feed or whatever, and you can see the birds hanging around. She's got a bird on top of her head. She's looking at him thinking, "Ah, you dumb fart, that bird's gonna shit on your new suit." And she doesn't realize there's a bird sitting on top of her head. But that's just old people. But they're, inspired by my mom and the ladies that would hang out in the
caregiver's home that she stayed in. It was kind of a combination of elderly ladies. They wouldn't get up and leave their bedroom until they put on their pearls and or their pop beads. Their sweaters were all stretched out, and they had half a box of Kleenex stuffed in the pockets so they wouldn't run out. A wristwatch that was big enough that they could read it. So they'd get the man's wristwatch, the biggest dial they could find.
Dave, what was that granny finished with? There was a finish on it, but what was it?
It's wool linseed oil.
That's it.
The one we're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah. See, it does get dark, but that dark kind of gives it a patina that I think.
Yeah.
I like.
So it's not a tinted linseed oil. It's just the straight.
No, just the straight boiled linseed oil. I don't tint anything.
All right, that's cool. I like that.
I did go back in, and in the depths, I used a little burnt sienna just to emphasize some of the shadows. But there's nothing.
Did you do a wash on her hair and beads? Is that different? I can't tell.
There's a little bit of antique white wash in her hair and her beads, and there's a little more burnt sienna on her shoes. But for the most part, and her eyes are painted in. But for the most part, very little color on her.
I love the patina that's gotten on it.
Dave, was that an attempt at like a sepia carving, what they call?
Yeah, the burnt sienna does that. So this is one I didn't want to darken. And she hasn't, and I don't know why, but thankfully she hasn't. This is one
Does she have boiled linseed oil?
She does. Yeah.
What's the time difference between like when the granny was finished and when that one was finished? Does that make sense? Like how long between the two?
Yeah. Probably 5 years between the two.
Yeah, but she hasn't darkened at all?
Well, not that I can tell. Now, if I saw photographs of the original, I could probably say, oh, yeah, she's starting to darken some. But, yeah, she hasn't darkened up so much.
That's cool. I was just curious. Thanks.
With her, I actually like the way that the flow and her diaphanous gown kind of came out. But the way I got that was I used an armature with clay to do the figure. I did a nude figure, and then I took clay strips and draped them like coils of clay for the high points on this, and then filled it in. But
so Dave, you're a real carving nerd, and it seems like you study art quite a bit. If you had a go-to artist and someone that you would go back for reference material, is there anything in particular that you could share with us?
no, you know, I don't want to piss anybody off or, you know, badmouth anybody for what they say or the way they teach. But it's almost like I'm a real stickler for, because when I've done larger pieces, like the ones I've just shown you, okay? When I get ready to do something like that, a serious piece, not just sitting there knocking something out, a competition piece, if you will. And I feel like I'm going to have to go up against guys like Fred Cagelo, or, you know, some of the big name Carvers or Desi, or, you know, I'm getting into a competition, national competition, where there's going to be some high name ranked carvers. If I even want my things to get looked at, I'm going to have to really kick it up a notch, just because it's caricature. And CCA or not, we still haven't elevated that level of the public's perception, especially judges. I entered that female in a competition in Belleville, and it didn't even get an honorable mention. And it had taken best of show in a previous show. And when it didn't even get an honorable mention, I asked the judge for a critique, and nice guy, I like the guy, but we went over and he said, "Which one's yours?" And I said, it's the lady up there. He says, "Oh, well, you entered it in the wrong category." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "You entered it in caricature." "Yeah, but it's not funny." So when he judged caricature, he just judged based on, the blue ribbon goes to the carving that's the funniest, in his opinion. So, people just don't even understand caricature. Even knowledgeable carvers, knowledgeable enough to be a judge. So, yeah. But for me, proportional elements are important. Symmetry is important. When I say symmetry, I'm talking about bone structure. When you start bending bones, all of a sudden, caricature, if you consider realism on one end of a scale and cartoon on the other, caricature is that gray area in between. And some caricature is really borderline cartoon or in the cartoon field. Some caricature is over here closer to realism. And the stuff I like, the stuff I try to do, kind of closer to the realistic end of the scale, kind of what Emil Janelle used to do. He's been my inspiration. It was back when I had Pete Engler want to put some of my carvings in his shop. And he said, "I want you to come down tomorrow meet me at 9 o'clock. We'll have a cup of coffee and talk about putting your work in the shop." And of course, I show up at 8 o'clock because I don't want to be late for this opportunity. And he says to me, he says, "The biggest problem I have with you and your carvings is," he says, "I look at your carvings, I don't know who you are." Well, what the hell you mean? He says, "Well, if I look at a piece, if I say Harold Enlow, what comes to mind?" "Well, Ozark characters, hillbillies." "Yeah, okay. If I say Janet Cordell, what comes to mind?" "Oh, well, her females, kind of more realism." "Yeah. If I say Gerald Sears, oh, well, cowboys." If I say Dave Stetson, well, I don't know. I mean, I look at your work, I look at your table, your display. You got everything from cowboys to sports figures to historical things to cartoony shit and realistic stuff. And he says, "I don't know who you are. You're going to have to focus. You got to decide what you want to do and who you want to be before you be respected and looked at with any kind of notoriety in the wood carving world." And I thought, "Oh, geez, what do I do?" So on a 2-day drive home from Branson to Phoenix, I'm thinking about this. And I'm thinking, what do I want to do? Do I want to do cowboys? Do I want to compete with the other cowboy carvers? Because I did quite a bit of those. Do I want to do, what do I want to do? And I thought, well, I like the work that Janelle does. And since he's kind of dead and gone, and there's not that many guys that would fit into that category of carving the everyday people that you run into today, that's where I've stepped in. So that's what I'm trying to do. That's what I've tried to focus on. And I think my work has improved a lot. I'm doing a lot fewer Santas. I mean, I still do a bunch, but not as many as I used to do. Hell, Michelle and I would sit down and we'd probably knock out between us somewhere between 50 and 100 Santas a year. And most of those were done in October. I mean, we were really churning them out. But
yeah, she would carve a piece and paint it. Finished, she'll start another one, carve it and paint it. Me, hell, I'd knock out 4 or 5 and then try to paint them all at the same time. Thought it made more sense. I could get them done faster. Well, one day I had 4 or 5 of them sitting there, and she looked up, had just finished painting one. Said, "You want me to paint one of those for you?" I said, "Yeah, if you don't screw it up." So she took a piece and started to paint on it. And she made it look a hell of a lot better than it would have if I'd painted it. So she's trying to teach me how to paint. And I don't know what it was, but I just didn't have the patience to paint the way she painted. She would take as long to paint a piece as it takes to carve it. And I wanted to get through it a little faster. So I didn't have the patience, and up until she had a stroke, I was still not doing a good job of painting. But once she couldn't paint anymore, I was forced to follow. I mean, I sit there and I would paint, and her voice is in the back of my head telling me, "That's too much color. It's too much color. More water, slow down, get it right, build up layers," she says. And, it's like, Jesus. I did a bird class. We carved a goldfinch, Lou Hammer, instructing the class, and they're going to paint this goldfinch yellow, and they water it down, and they're going to build up this yellow with multiple coats, and they're going to put like 20 coats on it to get it up to the color. They put the yellow on and blow it off with a hair dryer, and put on some more and hair dry it down. I thought, well, hell, we could speed this process up a bit if we put a little more color in the water. So I got my yellow goldfinch in about 6 coats. These other guys are really taking their time. But when they got done and we put them all up on a table, mine stuck out like a sore thumb. I did not have the soft, smooth, bird-like look that you want from a songbird. Mine looked more like a caricature bird. So there's a reason for it, and you just have to force yourself to follow it.
Dave, your painting video that you did was wonderful, because it taught me that patience. Because I take time now, I do the boiled linseed oil and then let it completely dry, because that got to the oil question I had for you previously, where the oil and water don't mix. So giving that time and patience and layers, like you talked about, works really well.
Well, the oil and water don't mix, but the wood is porous. So even with the oil in it, there's enough porosity that the acrylics will go in there. When I mentioned the bird carvers and the hair dryer to dry it, if you've got boiled linseed on your carving, don't use a hair dryer. That linseed oil will just bubble right up to the surface and pull the color right up with it. Yeah. No.
Hi, Dave.
Yeah.
Sorry. Have you ever done a piece? Sorry, I've been carving for at least 24 hours now, so pretty new. Have you ever done any piece that's ended up being controversial, or you got in trouble for at a competition?
Dave, you can always tell them about the X-rated CCA carvings that no one's seen.
Back in the day, they used to have a competition, and they would hold it in Carvers, Indiana. Tommy Brown would host it. Guys would send their carvings in, but it was all, they were all X-rated carvings. That was the competition, the category and the competition. So, it was, I never got into that. Not that I didn't want to, it's just that by the time I found out they were doing it, it was over with. Communications were a little slower back then. And when you're slow-minded in the first place and you're dealing with slow communication process, it doesn't bode well for knowing what's going on.
there's the, you know, Harold calls them his closet carvings. He's got a whole collection of them where they stay in a drawer, but they don't come out where people can see them. About the worst I did a bug carving class, and I had a ladybug that from the back side it looked like a ladybug, red with the black dots, but when you turned her around, she looked like a Vegas showgirl, a Rubenesque Vegas showgirl. You know, she was kind of rotund, but that's about as risque as I get. But that other carving of the girl back here, that she's got, the dress is only draped over one half of her breast and the hair's covering the other one. That was too risque for Engler's shop. So, you know, you carve them, but then what are you going to do with them? You know, you got to hide them somewhere. Dunham did that golf ball. Dunham used to do, but he was the one. God, he had carvings that he would take to competition, and he'd carry them around in a paper sack. He had a bald eagle that you pull out of the bag, and you had to flip it over to see the eagle's balls. But he was really that kind of guy. He did. When we did the saloon scene, Dunham did the piano player and the piano, sitting at the piano with a snake crawling around the legs of his chair. But he created this little piano, and there was a little cigar box latch on the top of the piano, so you could open it up. And when you opened it up, this little topless cheerleader would pop up out of the piano. And you put it on a spring and fold it back in and close the lid. Well, Rich Weatherby was carving the girl that sits on the piano. So Dave carved the piano and mailed it off to Rich. And then when Rich got it, opened it up, this little girl popped out for him. But it's still there. And I don't think half the people at Woodcraft know about it. So, but it's in there. But yeah, I don't know where that question came from. Was it something I did or something I said?
It was more as you mentioned, like the girl in the background. I wondered if you'd ever entered something like that into a competition, and they're like, "Oh no, you can't enter that."
See, no, yeah, anglers wouldn't take that. They said, "No, it's not gonna. We can't have that in here. People could be offended by that." But I never saw it that way. I figured it was covered up. I was trying to make her kind of sexy and sensual and all those things that are hard to create in wood. So.
Yeah. I've got another question. As I mentioned, I'm just starting out. I got into whittling and carving. I dated a woman many years ago, and she was native. I live in Canada, in Alberta, and she used to carve, and I used to love watching her doing it. And it's just recently I picked up some knives and figured I'd give it a go myself. So if I was to try caricatures, what's the easiest caricature I could start off doing to start getting practice?
Wow. The easiest one to start with. Well, you threw me a curve. I'm not...
Would that be an Oscar from like Harley?
The left half of my brain wasn't out there, but just something simple, something learning to control your cuts. I think those of you that are flat plane carvers, if you take a class with Harley Ruff, so Harley calls it the simple art or the complicated art of simplicity. Yeah, I think that's the way he states it.
I got a suggestion for you. They're in England. Do you go in for cricket?
I know cricket. I live in Canada, so don't let the accent put you off.
Well, okay. Can't cricket's a big sport in the UK and in the likes. And if you take a cricket a batsman and the wicket and create from there something that looks humorous, like a sticky wicket, the things that are common in the sport or in the game, and it becomes the kind of thing that or the bowler, all those things you can find humor in, and you can create the movement in the character that you need to, and you start out with the stick figures. You just draw a simple stick figure and put his shoulders one direction and put his hips another and put one foot forward and the other foot back, and like Dave uses a lot of clay, because before he ever builds or starts carving, he just builds it out of clay.
Oh, thanks for that. Yeah, I didn't think of like building a mock of it first, because starting out with whittling, you're thinking, I've got a block and I'm going to bring it down to this piece of art. I didn't think build it up first to then get that example. Thanks for that.
Well, carving is sculpting. Clay is the opposite. Clay is modeling. You're adding on. But just learning to keep your tools sharp, learning to create clean, smooth surfaces on the wood is the biggest challenge you're going to have. And that's a combination of working with the grain of the wood and keeping your tools sharp. But once you keep it clean, beyond that, it's knowing the subject in your mind. Hands are tools of the mind. They can do whatever the mind knows to tell them to do. Wood carving is the simplest thing in the world to do. There's only 3 damn things you can do to a piece of wood. I don't care how many tools you got. You can make a straight cut through it. You can round it over, make a concave surface. Or you can dig into it and make a convex surface. And you can do that with a knife. You can do it with gouges. You can do it with 100 different tools of different sizes. But it's how those 3 surfaces meet and how they come together that create what you're trying to do.
Okay, thank you very much.
It's rough and chewed up, it's not going to look as good as it does if it's smooth and clean.
Thanks for that. I appreciate that.
Hey Dave, is there who in the CCA is your the guy that you think that you look to, the most inspirational when you hang out, or the one that kind of takes you to the next level?
Right now, it's Ryan. Yeah, I don't know who Ryan looks up to, but I kind of got the impression from things he said that he was looking up to me. Ryan has taken Steve's place in the one that I share with. Ryan sat down with me. We were in Branson at the hotel one night, and he sat down next to me and he said, I want to spend some time with you. He says, I want to carve some female heads and faces. I said, cool. So he sat down and we did, and I told him what I knew. And the next time I saw him, he had done female faces and bust figures that were better than mine. And I said, hey guy, come on, let's feed some of that back to me. What are you doing? What did you're doing? You've taken it to the next level. And he said, well, I'm just doing this, or I'm doing that. And I said, oh, cool. I like that. Yeah. And he said, and then I talked to Harold, and I asked Harold the same thing I asked you. And he said, Harold showed me some things. And I said, cool. And so right away, I start taking some more things that I picked up from Ryan and probably Harold or whatever. And I'm starting to put those into my pieces. And then the next time I saw Ryan was a year ago in Maquoketa. Ryan was teaching a class, and he had some really cool looking pieces. And I looked at him and I said, yeah, man, I like this. But I saw him up in Midway, Utah, at one of our meetings before that, and he had 3 or 4 heads that he was showing off, and I was looking at those and trying to get some ideas from him. And he had a really good looking blonde, and I wanted to know what color he was using for that blonde hair, because yellow doesn't cut it. He said, I think I used a honey something. Well, I come to find out it was a honey brown. He couldn't remember, but we used the honey brown for the blonde hair. And if you get a nice wash, light wash, it comes off really well. So, you know, it's one of these things where you trade ideas back and forth. And right now, Ryan is the one that I most look up to for what he's doing and what I'm trying to do. And we just share. So, but that's kind of what we were hoping the CCA would be about. Yeah. But again, people are always telling us, you know, old you know, over here, I'm trying to come up with a name that doesn't sound like anybody. But so-and-so over here, he should be in the CCA. He's really good. And it's like, yeah, okay, good. Well, to get in the CCA, you have to present yourself, not physically go out and say, hey, look at me, but through what you do and through how you act and how you present yourself, you have to make an impression on one of us to the point where that person says, okay, I would like to nominate this person for the opening that we have. And we've only got 25 of us. We've kind of held to that. And some people, it's taken several shots at voting to try to get them in. You got to have an 80% vote, 80% positive vote to get in. And some guys just aren't going to get there, because that's one of the reasons we don't share what happens at a meeting, is because we talk about these people. We talk about these people that are being presented. And we go around the room. Do you know this person? Have you ever heard of them? What do you think? And people will say, you know, I've known that person for X amount of time, and I think he's worthless piece of shit. So, you know, then he's not going to get voted, especially by the people who don't know him. And then somebody else will say, oh, but he's so good, you know, and people watch him and like what he does, and he think he's really great. And it's like, okay, so here we go. Everybody has their say, and then we vote. And if they don't make it, they can be brought up again. So some guys
to that point, Dave, like where do you see CCA going in the future? Because, you know, I'm a pretty young guy, and I'll go to carving classes, and I'm very aware that it's, you know, there's a lot of experience, but it's not going to be around forever. So how do you see it moving forward in this brave new world?
Hopefully we've got the bylaws set in place that it'll continue after we're gone. I find less and less that I need to speak up in a meeting situation and say, hey guys, this isn't where you're going with this, isn't what we had intended. We would rather see something along these lines. So when I'm not around to pull on the reins a little bit, you know, to keep them directed the way we think we'd like to see it go, we just have to be careful who we bring on board. Be careful who we nominate and who we bring into the organization to try to keep it on that path that we've
set it on. So Steve and I used to just sit there and look at each other, and he'd elbow me and tell me to shut up, and we would discuss things and say, well, how do you think we ought to deal with this, and do you think we ought to go there or not? And it's just so much of it's human nature. And so you try to bring in people, and when you get a group of people that get along with one another, number one, we've got it. It was my second time as president. One of the members was really, had kind of gone off the deep end. He had a way about him that tended to piss people off. And he wasn't a good representative of the organization. And we don't have a sergeant at arms, you know, so I had to take him aside and talk to him. I told him, I said, you know, I need to talk to you when you get some time. And he said, okay. And so I had gone out to the parking lot to get something from the car, and he showed up. And he said, can we talk now? And I said, yeah. And he said, okay. And he asked me, he says, how come you don't like me? I said, because you're a fucking weasel. You know, you just don't seem to be able to get along with anybody, you know, because of this and because of that. And that kind of, you just kind of put it out there, and that's the way it is. So he resigned. He went emeritus. I had never heard of emeritus before. I didn't know what the hell it was. And we've got, I mean, you name it, as far as professions go, we got it across the board, you know, doctors, lawyers, bankers. We got educators. And it's a term that educators use, you know, when someone retires from teaching, they're nominated for an emeritus status. So that's, which is a position of honor. And it's just never been, in my opinion, that big an honor to be emeritus from CCA. So when it's time for me to say I've had enough, that's when that day comes. That day comes. But it's been a lot of fun. I've got a lot out of it, and geez, I got to tell the guys that I think for our next meeting, instead of everybody buying a plane ticket and flying halfway across the country and paying for $100 for a night for a hotel room, we can just kind of log on to Zoom and have our meetings.
I don't know about that, Dave. Some of us enjoy it when you do have the meeting, because then we get to hear the conversations.
Well, you don't hear the conversations in the meeting unless you're there or you got the room bugged.
I hear what you're saying, yeah.
But no, that doesn't mean that we wouldn't go somewhere and be involved in an event, but it would save us a day. So that day saved is the hotel room and meals. And
we have enjoyed the gatherings when we get to be a part of the conversation or hear those conversations. So that's good stuff for us.
Thanks. We appreciate that. I think for the most part, we as a group are respected. Like I say, there's always those who aren't included, who may not have nice things to say, but for the most part, it's been a good ride. Yeah.
Dave, I hate to stop you here. We're pushing 2 hours on the meeting, an hour and a half on the recording.
Thank you, Mike.
So I wanted to just take a few minutes again to thank you for taking your time out to speak to us today. I think we've captured some stories and information that maybe is not recorded out there that will probably be around after all of us move on. But thank you again for taking your time. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. Thank you for the contributions you've made to the carving community. And we appreciate the opportunity to continue to learn from you, Dave. So thank you for everything today. And thanks again also for joining in on these meetings. We encourage everyone to continue to promote this. We plan on continuing to have this forum so that we can get together and talk about carving. So thanks again for joining in. Anything else you want to add, Dave, before you go?
Been good, thanks.
All right, thank you. Guys, again, we'll meet next week. Kaylee Schofield from Wood Carving Illustrator will be with us. She'll be talking about how to submit articles to the magazine and how they develop those articles and create the magazine. So look forward to hearing from her. And again, we're asking for people that want to volunteer to speak on these meetings. So if you have anybody you want to encourage to come out and speak, then just let me and Tom know. Tom, is there anything you need to add?
No, I think that's everything. Thanks, Dave, and thanks for everyone for participating in these meetings. Like Blake said, if you can, just share the word that we do this so that the carving community continues to grow.
And having said that, tonight we'll upload this video to YouTube, Facebook. We'll put a link on Instagram, and that way people can go out and look at this later on if they're not able to watch it live. So just, again, encourage people to go out, check it out. View all the other videos and let us know if there's anything else you want to hear or anybody else you want to hear from. So thanks again for joining us. And Dave, thanks again for all that you do.
Hey, Blake, you mentioned Teespring earlier in the call.
Yes, sir.
If you could provide instructions on how to search Teespring for the items, that'd be great.
So if you go to Teespring and just put in International Association of Woodcarvers, it should pop up for you. If not, we'll put a link on the page also.
There is a link on our Instagram page. So if you want to check it out there, there's a link at the top in the bio.
All right. If there's nothing else, we appreciate you joining in, and we'll see you next Saturday at 3 p.m. Eastern time.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks,
Blake.
guys.
Thanks, Dave.